This week on the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, Neil Bisson, a retired Canadian Security Intelligence Service intelligence officer, and the director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network, examines a series of stories that reveal how weak systems, hostile actors, and modern security threats are increasingly intersecting in ways many governments are still struggling to confront. We start in Hong Kong, where new amendments to the city's national security law allow police to demand passwords and access to phones and computers from individuals suspected of national security offences. We then turn our attention to Canada's international student system. A new federal audit has raised serious concerns about fraud, weak compliance enforcement, and the possibility that access to Canada may be more vulnerable to exploitation than many policymakers are willing to admit. In this vein, we look at a new CBSA enforcement efforts targeting extortion-linked criminal networks, including cases involving individuals who entered Canada through temporary resident pathways before becoming involved in serious criminality. But it's not just Canada and Canadians that are under threat. The international students themselves may be vulnerable to recruitment and coercion by criminal actors, raising broader questions about how system weakness can create vulnerability not only at the border, but also inside Canadian communities. We also examine the Toronto Police Service's new Counter-Terrorism security unit, a new US congressional probe alleging that Beijing has systematically used corruption, espionage, and influence operations to penetrate and manipulate institutions within the United Nations system, as well as Russia-backed recruitment and training camps in Moldova, offering yet another example of how grey zone tactics are increasing. Are you ready? Let's go!
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. I'm your host, Neil Bisson, a former CBSA frontline officer, retired intelligence officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and the director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network. Every week I take the most pressing stories related to national security, espionage, foreign interference, sabotage, and terrorism from around the world and turn that information into actionable intelligence you can use in your career and your life. It's been a busy week, from the Auditor General slamming the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada student visa program to Toronto Police Services announcing a new counter-terrorism security unit. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive in. We head to Hong Kong for our first segment, where the government has taken another significant step away from civil liberties and rule of law norms that many people once associated with that territory. The BBC this week is reporting that under new amendments tied to Hong Kong's national security law, police can now require individuals suspected of national security offences to hand over access to their phones and computers, including passwords. Those who refuse could face up to a year in jail and a fine of up to 100,000 Hong Kong dollars or almost $20,000 Canadian. While those who provide the authorities deemed to be false or misleading information could face up to 3 years in prison. On its face, some people may hear and think, well, police in democratic countries can also compel access to devices in some investigations, which is true, but the context here is entirely different, and that difference is critical. The real issue is not simply whether police can demand access to a phone or computer. The issue is what kind of state is exercising the power, under what legal framework, and against what kind of conduct. And in Hong Kong, that is where this becomes deeply concerning. The national security law, imposed by Beijing in 2020 following a mass 2019 pro-democracy protest, does not operate like narrowly tailored public safety or counter-terrorism law in a liberal democracy. The national security law imposed by Beijing in 2020 following the massive 2019 pro-democracy protests does not operate like a narrowly tailored public safety or counter-terrorism law in a liberal democracy. It covers a wide and often vaguely defined range of offenses, including secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. That is important because in authoritarian systems, broad legal definitions are not an accident, they are a feature. They create a framework where the state can decide, often after the fact, what constitutes a threat. And once that kind of ambiguity is built into the law, the scope for political repression expands dramatically. That is exactly what appears to be happening here. The new amendments reportedly also give customs officials the power to seize items they believe may carry a seditious intention. That phrase alone should concern anyone paying attention. Because when a government begins using vague and politically flexible concepts like sedition, collusion, or national security to justify expanded search, seizure, and detention powers, what it is really doing is lowering the threshold for coercive state intervention. And that is not simply a policing issue, it's an intelligence and regime control issue. Authoritarian governments often rely on national security laws not only to stop genuine violence or espionage, but also to suppress dissent, activism, journalism, political organization, and even contact with foreign institutes or governments. In other words, national security becomes the legal and political language used to criminalize opposition. And that is exactly why developments like this matter well beyond Hong Kong. From an intelligence perspective, this is part of a much broader model of state control through legal coercion. Modern authoritarian states do not always need mass arrest or overt force to silence people. In many cases, it is more effective to create a legal environment where people begin to self-censor because they know the state can compel access to their communication devices, networks, and personal information whenever it chooses. That is an extraordinarily powerful tool. Once a state can access a person's phone or computer under the law, as broad as this, it is not just looking for evidence of a crime. It is potentially gaining insight into that person's contacts, communications, political networks, media habits, organizational ties, and links to people outside the territory. That is intelligence value, and that is why this law should never be viewed purely as legal or policing developments. They also create mechanisms for surveillance, intimidation, and social control. That is especially important for diaspora communities, because many people who have left Hong Kong, including activists, journalists, and critics of Beijing, continue to have family, friends, and professional ties back home. Laws like this can create both direct and indirect pressure far beyond Hong Kong itself. Overall, this latest move in Hong Kong is not just another technical legal amendment. It is another clear sign that the national security law continues to evolve in a powerful instrument of political control, surveillance, and coercion. The ability of police to demand passwords and access to digital devices under this law that is this broad should concern anyone who cares about civil liberties, due process, and the abuse of state power in the name of security. And for the intelligence and national security professionals, this is also a reminder of something that we should never forget. Authoritarian states often use language of stability and security not just to justify tools that are ultimately designed not just to protect the state, but to control society. This new law will create a real communications and source protection concern for any intelligence organization or service with sources who transit through, reside in, or maintain ties with Hong Kong. The PRC have shown a propensity for acquiring access to government institutions in North America and Europe, and this could lead to sources being outed if communication devices are seized by them. We head to Canada for our main story this week for the next few segments. A new federal audit is taking a closer look at Canada's international student program, and while many people will understandably see this as an immigration, housing, or post-secondary education story, I think that misses the bigger issue. This is, in actuality, a national security and law enforcement story. The Office of the Auditor General has confirmed that it is examining whether Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, or the IRCC, effectively implemented reforms to the international student program after Ottawa introduced new measures in 2024 to reduce intake, strengthen program integrity, and address fraud. And that last word, fraud, that's what makes this story far more serious than many Canadians may initially realize. From a public policy perspective, the international student file is often discussed in terms of housing shortages, pressure on local infrastructure, and the growing dependence of colleges and universities on international tuition. Those are all real concerns, but from an intelligence and law enforcement perspective, the more serious question is this. What happens when a high-volume administrative system becomes vulnerable to manipulation, fraud, and weak enforcement? Because once that happens, the issue is no longer simply bureaucratic. It becomes a question of access. And the numbers in this audit are what makes this so difficult to ignore. According to the Auditor General, IRGC verified more than 841,000 letters of acceptance and flagged over 12,000 for possible fraud. It also identified more than 153,000 students as potentially non-compliant with the terms of their student permits. That number alone should be setting off alarm bells. Yet despite identifying more than 153,000 potentially non-compliant students, IRCC launched only 4,057 investigations. In other words, only a very small fraction of those cases were ever examined in a meaningful way. Of those 4,057, only 50 students were ultimately confirmed as non-compliant. In just 3 investigations, however, officials identified 800 student permits that had been issued between 2018 and 2023 where fraudulent documents or misrepresentation were allegedly involved. This is not a minor administrative irregularity. What this points to is clear vulnerability in the immigration system. The program appears to have been operating at a scale far beyond its ability to properly verify, monitor, and enforce its rules. this is not just a theoretical concern. As I've discussed in previous episodes of Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, including in relationship to the Hardeep Singh Nijjar assassination, concerns have already surfaced around whether individuals associated with serious criminal activity or violent activity may have entered Canada and remain in Canada through temporary resident pathways, including the student permit stream. That matters because national security threats do not always arrive in the form Canada thinks they do. I can tell you from personal experience, terrorists, spies, and violent criminals cannot be identified by their appearance. They could potentially be identified on a watch list, but sadly that watch list is not exhaustive. Sometimes these threats to Canada arrive as facilitators, enablers, criminal proxies, or individuals who appear administratively insignificant until they become operationally important later. That is why the integrity of the visa and immigration systems are so important to Canada's national security and safety. The real issue is not whether every applicant is a threat, because clearly they are not. The actual issue is whether Canada has a system that is robust enough to identify the people who are. And based on these findings, the answer appears to be it does not. This is where immigration integrity and national security intersect in a way many politicians and policymakers still fail to fully appreciate or do anything about. Hostile states, transnational criminal networks, and extremist-linked facilitators do not always need to move people across borders in dramatic or clandestine ways. In many cases, they simply exploit systems that are already open, overloaded, and insufficiently verified. That is easier, safer, and far harder to detect in real time. A student permit, temporary visa, or educational pathway offers something very valuable to anyone with malicious intent: legitimate access to and presence inside Canada. And once that presence is established, it can create opportunities for nefarious individuals to conduct surveillance, access, logistics, planning, financial activity, or simply the ability to remain inside the country under a lawful pretext, until they need access to false identifications, new identities, and potentially turn to criminal activities to gain income to remain in Canada. That should concern not only immigration officials, but police, intelligence agencies, and policymakers alike. Because once someone is here, the burden shifts from prevention to reaction, and by then, the damage may already be underway. Overall, this Auditor General review matters far more than immigration policy or political optics. As provinces and designated learning institutes continue to push for more foreign students and workers to offset cost and sustain revenue, far little attention is being paid to the fact that some of the bad actors can clearly exploit these pathways in ways that can endanger the safety and security of Canadians. At its core, this is about whether Canada has allowed a large and strategically important immigration stream to become vulnerable to fraud, weak follow-up, and potentially much more serious exploitation. And if this is the case, then this is not simply a paperwork problem. It is a systems vulnerability that can be exploited by transnational criminal organizations, extremist-linked facilitators, and potentially hostile foreign state proxies to gain access and jeopardize Canada's safety, sovereignty, and long-term economic interests. Canada needs to stop treating immigration integrity, organized crime, foreign interference, and national security as though they exist in separate silos. They do not. As a former CBSA frontline officer and a retired intelligence officer with CSIS, I can tell you from experience that this lack of integrity and immigration system is leading to criminal and national security concerns that cannot be addressed through investigation and criminal prosecution alone. If we continue to treat immigration integrity this way, we will keep discovering these weaknesses only after they have already been exploited. We're sticking with the story in our next segment because if the Auditor General's report shows us how Canada's international student system may be vulnerable at the administrative level, the next story shows what can happen when those vulnerabilities begin to show up in the real world. The Canada Border Services Agency has announced an expansion of its efforts to disrupt extortion networks operating across Canada. According to CBSA, these investigations involve serious criminal activity including extortion, arson, drug trafficking, and firearms offenses. That alone should tell Canadians that this issue is no longer simply about immigration policy, it is also about public safety. According to the CBSA, the agency has opened 372 immigration investigations tied to extortion-related activity, issued 70 removal orders, and carried out 35 removals. Those are significant numbers, and they show that this issue has already moved well beyond the administrative concern. One of the most important details in the CBSA announcement is that one of the individuals publicly identified had reportedly entered Canada on a student permit before later being found inadmissible for organized criminality. That is exactly why this matters. Because when someone enters Canada through a legitimate administrative stream, whether it's a student permit, temporary visa, or another lawful pathway, the assumption is that the system has done enough to ensure that the person does not represent a serious public safety or criminal concern. But when those pathways are exploited, the consequences do not remain inside the immigration system. They become police files, they become border investigations, they become removals, prosecutions, and public safety threats. And that is where this story becomes much more serious than many Canadians may initially appreciate. As I've discussed on the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, this is not the first time concerns have surfaced around whether individuals tied to serious violence or criminality may have entered or remained in Canada through temporary resident pathways. That concern surfaced in reporting connected to the Hardeep Singh Nijjar assassination. The 4 individuals arrested in his murder were identified as entering Canada on student visas. Again, the issue is not whether international students as a whole represent a threat. They do not. The issue is whether Canada's temporary resident and student permit systems are significantly robust to identify and stop the people who do pose a threat. Because once someone gains lawful entry to Canada, they gain something incredibly valuable: presence. And that presence can create opportunity for criminal networking, intimidation, extortion, logistical support, or other forms of harmful activity. That is where immigration integrity becomes a law enforcement concern. From a law enforcement and intelligence perspective, this is exactly where administrative weaknesses become operational burdens. A vulnerable front-end system creates a back-end enforcement problem. Once an individual is already inside the country, authorities are left trying to determine who that person is connected to, what role they may be playing, whether others are facilitated through their entry, and whether their activity is isolated or part of a broader network. That is expensive, time-consuming, and in some cases, very dangerous. It also means that meaningful intervention may only happen after criminal activity has already been embedded. This is not where any country wants its first serious line of defense to begin. This is why immigration integrity should never be treated as merely bureaucratic housekeeping. It is directly connected to public safety, organized crime disruption, and national security. Overall, the CBSA announcement reinforces exactly why the Auditor General's findings matter. If Canada's international student and temporary entry systems are vulnerable to fraud, weak follow-up, or insufficient scrutiny, then those weaknesses can create openings not only for administrative abuse, but also for organized criminal actors, extremist link facilitators, and potentially hostile foreign state proxies to exploit. And once that happens, the burden shifts to border enforcement, law enforcement, and national security agencies to clean up the consequences after the fact. This is an inefficient and insecure system, and it is certainly not a reassuring one. This is why Canadians should stop viewing the international student file as simply an education or immigration issue. It is increasingly intersecting with the kinds of national security, public safety, and criminal threats that intelligence, police, and border agencies are already confronting in the real world. As the previous story demonstrates how weaknesses in the immigration system can create downstream law enforcement challenges, this next report adds another deeply troubling dimension. According to a recent Global News report, a student at the University of British Columbia says international students are being approached and recruited into extortion-related activity. From this perspective, we are not just talking about fraud or weak screening at the point of entry. We are now talking about whether some international students may become vulnerable to criminal exploitation after they arrive in Canada. This is an important distinction because it shows how the immigration system is leaving legitimate visa students vulnerable as well. Some people may exploit the system to get into Canada, while others may arrive legitimately and then find themselves vulnerable once they are here. That vulnerability can come from financial pressure, debt, uncertainty about immigration status, social isolation, fear, or simply a lack of confidence in reporting criminal approaches to the police. And from a criminal perspective, those kinds of pressures are often exactly what recruiters and extortionists look for. That is what makes this story so troubling, because it suggests that some of the same people who enter Canada through a system already showing signs of weakness may then find themselves targeted upon entry. Not by the immigration system this time, but by criminal actors who see them as useful, vulnerable, or expendable. This is where the international student issue becomes more than just a border or admissions problem. A weak or overloaded system does not simply create vulnerabilities at entry. It can also create vulnerabilities inside Canada. Once criminal networks understand that a particular population may be financially strained, disconnected from family, unfamiliar with Canadian law, and hesitant to go to police, they may begin to view that population not as people, but as opportunity. This is why foreign interference can be so devastating when combined with individuals who are allowed to vote for political party leaders but don't have permanent residency or Canadian citizenship. This is exactly the kind of exploitation police, border agencies, and intelligence professionals need to pay attention to, because criminal recruitment and extortion do not happen in isolation. They emerge inside environments where fear, dependency, and vulnerability already exist. This is where the conversations become more serious, because if international students are not only entering Canada through a system that has shown signs of weakness, but are also being targeted once in Canada by extortion networks or criminal recruiters, then we are dealing with a layered security problem. The issue is no longer simply who gains access to Canada via the immigration system. It is also about who becomes vulnerable after arrival, who gets pulled into criminal ecosystems, and who may become useful to actors operating in the gray space between organized crime, coercion, and intimidation. These are important issues to police, border authorities, educational institutions, community leaders, and policymakers alike. Because once these patterns become normalized, they become much harder to disrupt. Overall, the story is a reminder that system weaknesses creates more than one kind of vulnerability. It can create vulnerability at the border, inside the immigration process, and inside communities once people arrive. That is why the issue should not be viewed narrowly. It's not just about visas. It's not just about educational institutions. It's not just about fraud. It's about whether Canada has allowed a large and important temporary resident stream to become vulnerable not only to abuse, but also to criminal exploitation and coercion. And if that is happening, then this is not merely an administrative concern. It is a serious law enforcement and public safety issue, and one that deserves far more attention than it has received. Staying in Canada for our next segment, return to Toronto Police Services and their announcement of a new counter-terrorism security unit. A significant development for Canada's largest municipal police service. According to the Toronto Police, the new unit is being established in response to an evolving security landscape, and it is intended to strengthen Toronto's police's ability to detect, prevent, and respond to emerging threats. Alongside that, Toronto Police are launching Task Force Guardian to increase visibility and support public safety at strategic locations across the city. From an intelligence and national security perspective, this is a time to move. Chief Myron Demke said Toronto Police are operating in an increasingly volatile national security environment shaped by global conflicts, extremist ideologies, online radicalization, hostile foreign actors, and heightened polarization. He also noted that the Intelligence Security Services section saw sustained and increased demand last year related to counterterrorism, extremism, public order, and hate-motivated incidents. This is important because it tells us this decision did not come out of nowhere. It reflects a policing service that is seeing increasing pressure in a number of overlapping threat areas and has decided it needs a more dedicated capability to deal with them. The chief also referenced recent shootings at synagogues and the U.S. consulate in Toronto, along with attacks in countries such as Australia and the United States as part of the context behind this decision. That tells me Toronto Police are viewing local security concerns within a broader international and national threat picture rather than treating every incident as isolated. Toronto is one of the most internationally connected cities in Canada and one of the cities most exposed to local spillover effects of global tension. It is home to major public institutions, large diaspora communities, critical infrastructure, diplomatic interests, tourist attractions, and places of worship for various religions. But it also means that global tensions can become visibly local in very real ways. The article makes clear that Toronto Police see this as part of a broader and more complex environment. This is not just about one ideology, one conflict, or one kind of actor. It is about a wider threat picture that includes terrorism, violent extremism, online radicalization, hate-motivated activity, and the effects of international instability on local public safety. Toronto Police also said that the new unit will act as a rapid response hub and improved intelligence sharing in collaboration with partners including the RCMP and the OPP. That matters because threat actors do not respect jurisdictional boundaries. Intelligence sharing and coordination are essential if the police want to identify patterns early and respond effectively. One of the most important parts of this announcement is that Toronto Police described the new unit as a standalone capability supported by robust analytical capacity and dedicated leadership. That language matters. Effective counterterrorism and security work depends on more than visibility or emergency response. It requires analytical support, strong leadership, intelligence integration, and the ability to understand emerging trends before they escalate. Task Force Guardian is also worth paying attention to. Deputy Chief Frank Burrito said it will operate alongside the new unit and other specialized teams, including emergency management and public order. He described it as an intelligence-driven and focused on strategic locations such as community centers, places of worship, critical infrastructure, high-traffic public spaces, and tourist attractions. In practical terms, this means Toronto Police are trying to combine two things at once: a more specialized intelligence and security capability through the new unit, and a visible deterrent and reassurance posture through Task Force Guardian. Burrito also emphasized that these developments are not meant to alarm the public, but to enhance safety through a visible and measured policing approach. This is an important message because visible tactical policing can cause concern if people do not understand why it's happening. As I discussed in last week's episode of Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, where we examined the shootings targeting synagogues and the US consulate in Toronto, these types of incidents do not occur in a vacuum. They often emerge during periods of heightened geopolitical tension and can reflect broader threat dynamics that extend beyond traditional criminal activity. Overall, this appears to be a serious and proactive step by Toronto Police. The Toronto Police Service is clearly signaling that the threat environment facing Toronto has changed and that it requires a more focused response. The creation of a standalone counter-terrorism security unit combined with Task Force Guardian shows an effort to improve both prevention and visible readiness. Toronto Police also made clear that the new unit does not replace Project Resolute, which was launched after the October 7, 2023 conflict in the Middle East. In other words, this is being added to existing community engagement and public safety efforts, not substituted for them. The real test, of course, will be how this unit is trained, resourced, how effectively it integrates with partners, and whether it can translate intelligence-led policing into meaningful prevention. But based on what the Toronto Police have announced publicly, this is a notable development and one that reflects the reality of global instability and increasingly affecting local policing and community safety here in Canada. On to the United States for our next segment. A new congressional investigation in the U.S. is alleging that Beijing has systematically exploited the United Nations and its affiliated institutions to advance Chinese Communist Party interests through a combination of corruption, espionage, political influence, and institutional capture. At first glance, this might sound like a story about international diplomacy and global governance. But from an intelligence perspective, it's much more than that. If the allegations outlined in this report are accurate, what we're looking at is not simply influence in the normal diplomatic sense. We are looking at the use of international institutions as a vehicle for strategic penetration, political warfare, and long-term power projection. And more importantly for Canada, one of the institutions referenced in the reporting is based in Montreal. According to the article, a report from the U.S. House Senate Committee on Chinese Communist Party alleges that Beijing has pursued a coordinated effort to shape United Nations systems from within. The allegations include placing Chinese nationals into influential positions, leveraging financial contributions for political influence, using consultative status to amplify party-linked front organizations, and exploiting international institutions in ways that serve broader Chinese state interests. That is a serious allegation, but from an intelligence standpoint, not an implausible one. Authoritarian states do not view international institutions the same way liberal democracies often do. Democracies tend to see the organizations as neutral or rules-based mechanisms for diplomacy, cooperation, and conflict management. Regimes like the Chinese Communist Party often view them more instrumentally, as environments to be shaped, influenced, penetrated, and where possible, leveraged for strategic advantage. The distinction matters. If you can shape the rules, influence the agenda, place trusted individuals into key administrative roles, and marginalize criticism from within, you do not need to dominate an institution openly. You only need to quietly bend it slowly over time. This is not the first time concerns have been raised about Chinese-linked activity connected to international institutions in Canada. As discussed in a previous episode of Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, we examined reporting involving a Montreal-based United Nations official linked to an FBI investigation, highlighting similar concerns around access, influence, and institutional vulnerability. One of the more notable aspects of the article is its reference to the International Civil Aviation Organization, or the ICAO, which is headquartered in Montreal, Quebec. That should immediately matter to Canadians. ICAO is not some obscure body with no practical significance. It is a major international organization tied directly to global aviation standards, safety, policy, and technical coordination. If concerns are being raised about political influence, cyber concealment, or compromised institutional integrity in an organization physically located in Canada, then this is not simply an American political story. It becomes a Canadian national security and counterintelligence issue as well. The article points specifically to allegations involving former ICAO Secretary General Fang Liu, as well as a cyber incident reportedly linked to a China-affiliated threat actor. It also references Kwang Chi James Wan, a former IT official at the ICAO, who was later arrested in the United States and accused in a separate case involving alleged weapons-related dealings. Now, to be clear, allegations reported in open media are not the same as a conviction or a final intelligence assessment, but the pattern being described is what intelligence professionals would recognize as highly concerning. The placement of individuals in positions that provide access, influence, concealment opportunities, or strategic level inside a sensitive international body. And again, this is not unprecedented. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they think about espionage or foreign interference is assuming that it only happens through spies, clandestine meetings, or covert dead drops. In reality, some of the most effective foreign influence and intelligence activity takes place through institutions that appear perfectly legitimate. International organizations, business councils, academic partnerships, think tanks, civil society bodies, trade forums, and multilateral institutions all create opportunities for access and influence. They allow states to place people, shape narratives, build networks, suppress scrutiny, and create legitimacy around their preferred interests worldwide. And that is what makes this story so important. The article also references the China Energy Fund Committee, which reportedly held UN consultative status and has previously been linked to corruption and influence concerns. From an intelligence perspective, this is a classic example of what analysts would describe as the use of front or covert adjacent structures, organizations that appear to be independent or policy-oriented, but which actually function as an instrument of state influence or political warfare. This is not unique to China, but Beijing has become particularly sophisticated in this space. And this is where the broader strategic issue comes into focus. This is not just about bribery or corruption. It is about who gets to shape the global system, who gets to define legitimacy, and who gets to normalize the political interests inside institutions that are supposed to serve the international community. If those institutions are quietly being bent towards authoritarian interests that has downstream consequences for human rights scrutiny, sanctions enforcement, diplomatic legitimacy, international legal norms, aviation and infrastructure policy, and even the credibility of rules-based international order itself. Overall, this story should be viewed as more than just another geopolitical headline. If the allegations in these congressional probes are accurate, they point to something much bigger. A long-term Chinese Communist Party strategy to use international institutions not simply for participation, but for the strategic advantage and systemic influence. And for Canada, the ICAO angle makes this especially relevant. It is one thing to discuss foreign interference as something that happens in Ottawa in elections or diaspora communities. It is another to recognize that one of the world's major international organizations, located in Montreal, may also sit within the broader context of influence, access, and institutional control. That is exactly why counterintelligence and foreign interference awareness need to extend well beyond Parliament Hill and political debate. The real battleground is often inside the systems, institutions, and organizations that most people assume are neutral. And if those spaces are being quietly penetrated or manipulated, the democracies like Canada need to start treating that with the seriousness it deserves. For our final segment this week, we end up in Europe, where a new report from Politico Europe highlights what appears to be another example of Russia's hybrid warfare playbook, this time centered in Moldova. According to the article, Moldovan authorities say individuals were recruited and trained in the camps connected to pro-Russian networks, with the apparent purpose of preparing them for destabilizing activities. If this sounds like something out of the Cold War, it's not. This is very much a modern national security problem, and one that intelligence and law enforcement agencies across Europe and increasingly across broader democratic world are having to confront in real time. What makes this story so important is that it reflects a reality many governments are only now beginning to take seriously. Modern conflict is no longer confined to tanks, missiles, or traditional espionage. It increasingly involves covert recruitment, political manipulation, criminal facilitation, covert influence, sabotage, and the deliberate exploitation of social unrest. From an intelligence perspective, this story fits squarely within the broader pattern of Russian gray zone tactics and proxy operations. Russia has repeatedly demonstrated that it is willing to use methods below the thresholds of conventional war to weaken, intimidate, or destabilize countries it sees as strategically important. That includes cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, election interference, political subversion, covert funding, sabotage, and the use of proxies or sympathetic local actors. Moldova is especially vulnerable to this kind of activity. It sits in a highly contested geopolitical space, bordering Ukraine and facing long-standing Russian pressure through influence networks, energy dependency, disinformation, and political interference. That means any attempt to recruit and organize individuals for destabilizing purposes should not be viewed as an isolated security incident. It should be seen as part of a larger effort to shape Moldova's internal stability and strategic orientation. That is what makes this more than just a domestic public order issue. It becomes a national security issue. And this is one of the things that democracies often struggle with. A group of people being trained, mobilized, or organized can easily be dismissed as protest preparation fringe activism or political agitation. This is until you begin to understand who may be backing them, what methods are being used, and what the broader objective may be. This also aligns closely with what I've discussed in previous episodes of Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, where we examine Russia's increasing reliance on proxy actors to conduct sabotage operations across Europe. In those cases, individuals were recruited locally and used to carry out covert activities while maintaining distance from Russian intelligence services. This is where the concept of gray zone tactics becomes so important. Gray zone tactics are designed to exploit the gap between peace and open conflict. It allows a hostile state to create instability, fear, division, and strategic confusion without triggering any kind of military or legal response that a more overt act of aggression might provoke. This is exactly why these tactics are so effective. If a state can encourage unrest through local proxies, use sympathetic political actors, leverage organized networks, exploit public frustration, and hide behind plausible deniability, it can weaken a target while avoiding direct attribution for as long as possible. And Russia has become particularly adept at this model. One of the most important intelligence lessons in a story like this is that the recruitment is never accidental. People are not gathered together and trained for this kind of activity in a vacuum. Someone is identifying vulnerable or sympathetic individuals, shaping the grievance, providing support, and directing the activity towards a larger strategic purpose. This is why what is happening in Moldova matters beyond Moldova itself. It is another reminder that the Kremlin's toolkit is not limited to military aggression. It includes a full spectrum of covert and semi-covert tactics designed to wear down democratic resilience from the inside out. One of the most important intelligence lessons in a story like this is that recruitment is never accidental. People are not simply gathered together and trained for this kind of activity in a vacuum. Someone identifies them, someone motivates them, someone provides resources, someone determines the purpose behind the mobilization. This is where intelligence and counterintelligence work becomes so crucial. Intelligence professionals must not only look at the individuals involved, they also need to understand who recruited them, who financed the effort, who provided direction, what grievance or narrative was used to motivate them, and what operational role they were expected to play. That matters because hybrid actors often rely on ordinary-looking intermediaries. They don't often recruit hardened operatives. In many cases, they recruit the politically aggrieved, the ideologically sympathetic, the financially vulnerable, the socially alienated, or those who are willing to act without fully understanding who is behind the effort. That makes these operations especially dangerous, because by the time authorities identify what is really happening, many of the people involved may not even see themselves as part of a foreign-backed stabilization effort. They may believe they are simply protesting, resisting, helping, or standing up for something that they have been persuaded to support. That is one of the most effective aspects of modern hostile state activity. It uses people who do not fully appreciate the strategic purpose they are serving. Overall, this political report is another strong reminder that the future of conflict is already here, and in many cases, it does not look like traditional warfare. It involves covert organization, agitation, manipulation, influence, and the weaponization of instability. What appears to be happening in Moldova is important not just because of what it means for that country, but it reflects the broader Russian approach that has already been visible elsewhere in Europe and beyond. And for countries like Canada, this matters as well. We cannot assume these tactics are unique to Eastern Europe or only relevant to countries on Russia's immediate periphery. The broader lesson is that hostile states are increasingly willing to exploit internal vulnerabilities, social division, and local actors to achieve strategic outcomes without ever crossing the line in open war. That is why intelligence, counterintelligence, and early warning matter so much. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this week. I want to remind my listeners that the topics discussed in this podcast come from open source information. The links to all the articles are available in the transcript. This podcast is here to help you better understand the world of intelligence, espionage, sabotage, and foreign interference, not to tell you what to think. The Global Intelligence Knowledge Network is a resource for national security professionals, academics, and enthusiasts. We offer consultation to private industry, international corporations, and law enforcement organizations looking to stay ahead of the threats affecting their business, their safety, and their intellectual property. If you think you or your organization could benefit from what the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network has to offer, please reach out to me at the email listed in the show notes. I'll be happy to discuss your concerns and how those threats might be better understood and mitigated. Until next week, Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
That wraps up this week's Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. Thank you for listening. From the expanding powers of Hong Kong police under the national security law, to the vulnerabilities exposed inside Canada's international student system, and the growing overlap between immigration fraud, organised criminality, and public safety concerns, this week's stories all point to a common reality. Weak systems create exploitable opportunities. Whether those opportunities are used by authoritarian governments, criminal networks, hostile state proxies, or individuals operating in the grey space between them, the lesson is the same. When vulnerabilities are ignored for too long, they eventually become security problems. This week's episode also examined how those pressures are now showing up closer to home. From concerns about criminal recruitment and coercion targeting international students, to the Toronto Police Service's decision to establish a new counter-terrorism security unit, it is becoming increasingly clear that global instability and intelligence-driven threats are no longer distant issues. They are increasingly intersecting with local policing, community safety, and Canadian national security. Taken together, these stories reinforce a broader truth about the modern threat environment. Today's intelligence and security challenges are rarely isolated. They are interconnected, adaptive, and often hidden inside the very systems, institutions, and pathways we are most likely to take for granted. Producing the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up requires constant monitoring of international reporting, intelligence developments, and emerging national security trends in order to provide clear and practical analysis each week. If you find value in this work, you're encouraged to support the podcast by visiting Buzzsprout, where you can make a one-time or ongoing contribution. Your support helps sustain independent intelligence analysis and ensures this program can continue each week. Don't forget to subscribe, share the episode, and leave a review. It helps more listeners discover the show. And as Neil always reminds us, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.